Imagine a crime scene that makes no sense. The victim is dead, but the room is sealed from the inside, windows locked, doors bolted, no way in or out. This is what's known as a locked room mystery, made famous by Edgar Allan Poe in a short story known as The Murders in the Rue Morgue back in 1841. A murder in a room no one could possibly enter or leave. But what if that impossible crime happened in real life? This is the case of the Geoyodong Apartment Murders, one of South Korea's most chilling true crimes. A seemingly perfect family was found dead in their own home, every door and window locked from the inside. The crime scene looked like a flawless locked room, but this wasn't fiction. It was a calculated, cold-blooded act of evil, and police had to solve the impossible, unmasking a killer no one expected. Please make sure you are subscribed to my channel, you like this video, and let me know where you're listening from in the comments. Keep in mind that all the names used in this video are pseudonyms. Now, let's lift the thin veil. It's December 29th, 2003, around 7 p.m., a very cold winter's night in Seoul, South Korea. 34-year-old Mr. Na, an employee at a well-regarded international company, returns home to his 7th-floor apartment in the Geoyodong area in the Songpa District. Songpa is an affluent part of the city. If you live there, then you're doing okay in life, generally speaking. Normally at this hour, his wife, 31-year-old Mrs. Park, a homemaker, would be inside preparing dinner. Their 2 children, a 3-year-old son, and a 10-month-old daughter, would be there with her. By the standards of early 2000s Korea, they were a typical nuclear upper-middle-class family. A good job, a safe neighborhood, a devoted mother caring for the children. They were known to be friendly with their neighbors and well known within their community. On this evening, as Mr. Na returned home and reached for his apartment door, he strangely found it to be locked. This wasn't normal for them, so he knocked. Called out. No answer. That was bizarre. His wife was almost always home at this hour, especially with the children. Then he remembered. He'd forgotten his keys that morning. He tried the home phone, and although he could hear the ring through the door, nobody picked up. He then phoned his wife's closest friend, Miss Lee. Maybe his wife and kids were visiting her. Miss Lee was always at their home, often 3 or 4 times a week. She would be the one most likely to know where his wife had gone, and was the natural person to turn to for help. But Miss Lee told him his wife wasn't with her. Then she remembered something. Mrs. Park had mentioned to her about keeping an emergency key hidden in the hallway window frame. She offered to come over right away to help him find it. She eventually did come over, and they found the key. Mr. Na opened the door. Inside was devastation. Mrs. Park lay on the floor with a skirt pulled over her head, hiding her face. A clothesline was wrapped around her neck, tied to a door handle on the other side, keeping her head lifted off the ground. At first glance, it looked like she had hanged herself, but this would not be the case, which I'll explain in a second. On the floor near Mrs. Park was her 3-year-old son, a cloth tied tightly around his neck. Nearby, their 10-month-old daughter lay with a black plastic bag secured over her head. All 3 were dead. When police arrived, their first impression was grim but straightforward. The apartment had been locked, no forced entry. Windows were locked and barred. No unusual fingerprints or footprints, nothing broken. It looked impossible for anyone to have entered or left undetected, but as they looked more closely at the details, it became clear that this was Korea's first real locked room murder. On the surface, it looked like Mrs. Park had ended her children before taking her own life. But the lead detective had doubts almost immediately. Something felt off. In order to have done it herself, she would have needed to tie the other end of the rope around the door handle on the other side, and then have it over the door, then around herself. All of this with a baby in her hand, no friction marks from the clothesline, and just enough give that her feet wouldn't touch the floor. That would be physically impossible without another person involved. Additionally, dinner ingredients were laid out, preparations clearly in progress. This looked like life interrupted, not a carefully planned decision to end it. Adding to the doubts, Mrs. Park had no history of depression, no known mental health struggles, and left no note behind. Then there was the violence. The first red flag was the method. In cases where mothers kill their children, a rare but documented tragedy, the means are often less violent. Suffocation with a pillow, poisoning. As twisted as it is, there's often a distorted sense of mercy, but here, the killings were brutal. The bindings, the plastic bag, Investigators later found stomping marks on the little boy's chest and also the 10-month-old infant's neck. That level of aggression pointed away from a desperate parent and towards something far more malicious. It suggested an outside hand. The first logical suspect was the husband, Mr. Na. Standard procedure in such cases, as he was the last person to have known to be seen with them and the sole surviving member of the family, but his alibi was airtight. He'd been at work all day, confirmed by colleagues. He even had to call his wife's friend to get inside. On the face of it, they were a happy family who loved each other very much, and he was adamant neither he nor his wife would ever harm their children. Ruling him out so quickly left the investigation with a serious problem. If it wasn't a domestic dispute, then they were looking for an outsider who had somehow entered and exited a sealed apartment. That only deepened the sense of an impossible crime. Detectives questioned the neighbors. No one had seen or heard anything unusual, just the sound of the TV playing a bit loudly for a little while in the afternoon, which no one thought twice about. If someone else had been involved, how could they have come and gone without anyone noticing and without breaking that locked room illusion? It didn't make sense. The investigation was stalling. Every theory ran into the same wall, the locked room problem. It was 2003. DNA testing existed, but wasn't as advanced or widely used as it is now. Detectives couldn't simply swap for microscopic traces and get quick answers. They had to rely on traditional methods, applied with absolute thoroughness. The lead detective decided to track down the building's CCTV footage. Back then, not every apartment block had working cameras, but this one did, covering both the elevators and entry points. He knew that even the most careful killer could still leave a trace, and this time, it was a digital one. When they reviewed the footage, frame by painstaking frame, they found it. Between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m., the estimated time of death, a woman stepped into the elevator from the 7th floor, the victim's floor. She was alone, leaving. When shown the footage, Mr. Na identified her instantly. It was Miss Lee. It was extremely confusing at first. What would Miss Lee be doing there? And if she'd seen Mrs. Park and the children, then why didn't she tell Mr. Na when she saw him earlier that day? The police brought Miss Lee in for questioning, officially, just as a witness. Although she seemed mostly calm, the lead detective noticed something that he found unusual. The police station was warm, yet she kept her hands tucked into her sleeves, as if trying to hide them. It was a small, involuntary act, but his instincts told him it meant something. He pressed her to show her hands. She hesitated, looked uneasy, then reluctantly complied. Across her index finger was a thin, red, line-shaped mark. Her palm was red and swollen. The mark's width matched exactly that, but the clothesline found around Mrs. Park's neck. That was a direct link to the murder weapon and the act of strangulation itself, and it eventually led to the conversation about her whereabouts that night. They eventually confronted her with everything. The CCTV showing her leaving the victim's floor, the injury on her hand matching the clothesline. She claimed she'd heard her hand fixing something in her bathroom, but the story was vague, evasive, and quickly unraveled. Under intense questioning, faced with evidence she couldn't explain away, she finally broke and confessed. But it wasn't a remorseful admission. It was cold and defiant. She reportedly said, "It's true, I killed her, and her 2 children, and you will never find any proof." Even in confession, she clung to the belief that she had outsmarted everyone and that there was no evidence to tie her to the crime. Whether it was arrogance or delusion was unknown at this point, but it wasn't important to addressing the next problem the police were going to have. In South Korea at that time, a confession wasn't enough. By law, police had just 48 hours to find corroborating physical evidence to hold her. The clock was ticking. They moved fast, securing a warrant and heading straight to her apartment. First, they checked her alibi. There were no signs of any bathroom repairs, so nothing to support her story about how she injured her hand. That lie collapsed immediately. Then they found something far more significant. Hidden away was a plastic water bottle cut cleanly in half. At first glance, it looked like trash, but it matched a puzzle from the crime scene. Detectives had wondered how Mrs. Park could have been strangled from a closet door handle without leaving friction marks on the wood. The answer was chillingly simple. The smooth plastic surface of the bottle, used as a makeshift pulley, it could be placed on the doorframe so the rope slid over it, allowing someone to pull down hard without leaving a trace. And it didn't stop there. In Miss Lee's apartment, they found not just one, but dozens of these cut bottle prototypes. She had been practicing, perfecting the method. It was clear proof of careful, deliberate premeditation. Then came the most chilling discovery of all: a hidden diary. Inside, Miss Lee had documented everything. For months she'd outlined her plan in detail, step-by-step instructions, even sketches. She had written that she would carry out the crime before the end of 2003, setting herself a personal deadline. That diary was a window into her mind, cold, calculating, obsessive. It stripped away any remaining mystery, revealing the killings not as a crime of passion, but as a meticulously premeditated act of pure malice. Sadly, I couldn't find most of the diary entries online, and a lot of this information has been obtained from South Korean documentaries on this case. But this one page displays her plan to create the pulley system. So how did this path from friendship to obsession to murder even begin? Mrs. Park and Miss Lee had first known each other in high school, though they weren't particularly close back then. After graduation, they lost touch. It wasn't until 2001, 2 years before the murders, that they reconnected online. After reconnecting, the two women grew close, fast. Miss Lee was single, with plenty of free time, and she began visiting Mrs. Park's home constantly. She embedded herself into the family's daily life, helping them with chores around the house. Mrs. Park would cook for her, treat her like a family member. But that generosity may have only fueled something darker. Day after day, Miss Lee had a front row seat to what she saw as a perfect life that she didn't have. A husband, children, a comfortable home. The admiration quickly twisted into resentment. Proximity, when mixed with envy, can be corrosive. And while she played the part of the devoted friend, she was working behind Mrs. Park's back. She began sending flirtatious messages to Mr. Na, undermining his wife. Comments like, "I don't know why a good man like you got married so early," clearly aimed to drive a wedge between the couple. This wasn't new behavior for Miss Lee. It later emerged that she had once stalked a married high school teacher for 6 years, and she'd become obsessed with also another man who had to go into hiding. There was a clear pattern, targeting married men, trying to insert herself into an existing perfect life rather than building her own. It wasn't necessarily about the man himself, but about the life he represented. But this time, unlike with the married teacher, Mr. Na had responded. He wanted to reciprocate. Mrs. Lee and Mr. Na began their affair in January 2003, a full year before the murders. At the time, Mrs. Park was 8.5 months pregnant with their second child. It was a staggering betrayal from both her husband and the woman who had become their closest friend. The affair continued in secret for 10 months. For Miss Lee, it likely felt like she was inching closer to claiming the life she coveted. But in October 2003, her jealousy boiled over. She sent a text message directly to Mrs. Park that read, in essence, "Even if you have 2 children and live so nicely, your life is an empty shell. Your husband is my man after all." Keeping in mind that Mrs. Park had no clue what was going on at that time, it was jarring and confusing. But Mrs. Park eventually discovered text exchanges between Miss Lee and her husband on his phone, and she confronted them both. A huge fight followed. They denied everything, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that Miss Lee had meant to send the message to her own boyfriend but sent it to Mrs. Park by mistake. Obviously, because of the messages on Mr. Na's phone, it was a flimsy story. But Mrs. Park was in a difficult position. At the time, divorce carried a heavy stigma in South Korea, and doubly so if you had existing children. But the young child and the second on the way, she ultimately chose, or tried, to believe their explanation, forcing herself to move past it. Mr. Na was seemingly shaken by the near discovery, as he immediately cut ties with Miss Lee. He stopped all contact, turned his attention fully to his family, and presumably tried to repair the damage. For Miss Lee, being confronted and nearly exposed should have been a wake-up call, a reason to back off. But it had the opposite effect. It shattered her fantasy of replacing Mrs. Park. The man she believed would be hers had chosen the very person she wanted to replace. Her jealousy hardened into pathological hatred, fixated entirely on Mrs. Park. She saw her as the sole obstacle to the life she felt entitled to, and in her mind, there was only one solution. Mrs. Park had to die. The children, part of that life, had to die as well. It wasn't an impulsive decision. This was the point where her meticulous planning began in earnest, and this was reflected in her diary. Over weeks, the diary entries grew detailed: sketches, layouts of the victim's apartment, contingencies, step-by-step strategies. She even referred to herself as a perfectionist. It was no longer just hatred. It had become a project, an architectural plan for murder. Miss Lee's obsession and perfectionism drove her to attempt the murder at least 4 times in the 6 months before it finally happened. 4 times she prepared to strike, only to back out if anything felt even slightly off. If the timing or conditions weren't perfectly aligned with her plan, she aborted the mission. She had studied Mrs. Park's routine in meticulous detail. She bought everything she needed with cash to avoid leaving a trail. She even planned to use items already in Mrs. Park's home because she'd been inside many times and she knew where everything was. Then came December the 29th, 2003. That morning, Miss Lee visited Mrs. Park's apartment. Miss Lee had asked to borrow about 1.5 million won, around $1,000 at the time. Mrs. Park agreed to lend her the money. All smiles and friendly conversation. On the surface, it was another moment of generosity from a devoted friend with their past grievances buried. But the morning visit functioned like a final recon to make sure Mr. Na was at work, Mrs. Park was at home with the children, and everything was in place. That request for help, just hours before, was part of the trap, lowering Mrs. Park's guard completely. Miss Lee left, then returned between 3 to 5 p.m., walking into the apartment as she always did, casually. She chatted with Mrs. Park, maybe played with the children, biding her time. Then she began. Her first target was the 3-year-old boy. She lured him into one of the smaller rooms, telling him they were going to prepare a surprise show for his mother, using a child's innocence as bait. The boy followed her into the small room, excited about the surprise he thought they were preparing for his mother. She shut the door behind him, sealing them in. Then she stepped back into the living room briefly to turn the TV volume up, loud enough to cover any noise, calculated and controlled. Back in the small room, she put on gloves. She laid the boy on a shawl, rolled him in to restrict his movement, forced a towel into his mouth, pulled a plastic bag over his head, and strangled him with a cloth. When he stopped moving, she hid his body in a wardrobe, but then he wasn't gone yet and she had to make another attempt. She pulled him back out, strangled him again, then stepped on various parts of his body repeatedly before hiding the body once again. With the son's body hidden away, she calmly walked back into the living room. Mrs. Park was there, holding her 10-month-old daughter, watching TV. Miss Lee, acting as if nothing ever happened, chatted about the surprise her son was supposedly preparing. Meanwhile, in the small room, she had already prepared the next stage. The clothesline noose she'd practiced with was in place. On the doorframe, the halved plastic water bottle pulley was set to prevent friction marks. She called Mrs. Park over, told her to come see the surprise. Mrs. Park stepped into the doorway, excited, still holding her baby in her arms. Miss Lee grabbed a skirt and told her she needed to be blindfolded. It was part of the act. Using the skirt to disorient her, Miss Lee positioned Mrs. Park with her back to the door. Then she slipped the noose around her neck, stepped back into the room, climbed onto a chair, and jumped down, pulling with all her weight. Mrs. Park fought to breathe, but she never let go of her baby. That instinct to protect her child meant she couldn't use her hands to pull the clothesline away, leaving her with no defensive wounds. In the end, it sealed her fate. Once Mrs. Park was dead, Miss Lee removed the gloves she'd been wearing, which were damaged during the struggle, causing a mark on her hand, and took a fresh pair from the kitchen and went back for the baby. She found a plastic bag, placed it over the infant's face, then used a cord and a towel to end her life. When the baby gasped for air, Miss Lee reacted with the same brutality she'd shown the boy, using various methods, including stomping, to ensure the baby was gone. She did the same to the boy she'd hidden away in the closet for a 3rd time, just to be sure. With all 3 victims gone, she moved to the final stage, the cover-up. She tied Mrs. Park's body to the closet door handle, arranging it to mimic a hanging, to make it look like she took her own life. Then she locked the apartment behind her, using Mrs. Park's own key. The last step in her locked room illusion was getting the key back inside. She went to the hallway window, opened it just a crack, and slipped Mrs. Park's purse, keys inside, back onto the table. She reached through the security bars, placed it neatly, then closed the window. She walked away believing she had committed the perfect, untraceable crime. But despite all that planning, her scheme unraveled almost immediately. She was arrested the very same day, all because the lead detective noticed the injury on her hands during her questioning. During her psychological evaluations, Miss Lee showed almost no remorse. She blamed Mrs. Park entirely, insisting she deserved to die and had brought it on herself. She told the doctors, "Everything I wanted, everything belonged to me from the start." It was entitlement taken to an extreme, coupled with a complete lack of empathy, traits often seen in severe narcissistic or antisocial personalities. She showed no capacity to acknowledge fault or feel for her victims. When the case went to trial, the prosecution pushed hard for the death penalty, triple murder, extreme brutality, and clear premeditation. From the public's perspective, it seemed obvious, but surprisingly, the court didn't go that route. Instead, they sentenced her to life in prison. The court's reasoning varied, depending on the report. Some accounts said the judge considered her a first-time offender and mentioned the potential for rehabilitation. Other reports suggested she'd been diagnosed with depression during evaluations and had shown some remorse later on, though how genuine that was is debatable. She even appealed her sentence, submitting a letter of remorse in the process. I do not have the contents of this letter, but it wasn't taken very seriously by the court. The Supreme Court rejected her appeal, and the life sentence stood. She remains in Changshu Women's Prison to this day. Psychological evaluations painted her as a perfectionist with obsessive-compulsive tendencies, a strong need for control, and a history of stalking. There were signs of deep-seated issues, possibly tied to an insecure childhood, an absent father, and economic struggles. All of it contributed to a self-centered worldview, deep distrust of others, and the narcissistic mindset that fueled the murders. She had constructed an imagined life for herself and destroyed others when reality didn't match it. And then there's Mr. Na. His role is tragic. At first, he denied the affair, perhaps to protect himself or preserve his family's memory, but eventually, he admitted to it. His infidelity didn't cause the murders, but it definitely didn't help. It possibly even helped create the environment in which her jealousy and obsession could grow unchecked. The Geoyodong Apartment Murders remain one of South Korea's darkest cases, a story of obsession, betrayal, and calculated cruelty. It shows how envy can rot into something lethal, how a person can convince themselves they're entitled to another life, and how a perfect crime can still unravel because of one small detail. A locked room, an impossible crime, and a killer who believed she thought of everything until reality caught up. If you've made it this far, make sure you are subscribed, you like and leave a comment on this video. If you want to support the channel, then you can join as a member or donate on Ko-fi or buy me a coffee, with both links in the description. Thank you for watching.